I was camping in the middle of nowhere in Washington near Mount Rainier. Like, not an official campground, just way out in the forest where I wouldn't have expected another human for miles. One night I wake up to hear something, open my tent, and there's a guy sitting where my fire had been right outside my tent. Nothing particularly noteworthy about the guy, just a fairly regular looking dude, just sitting there a couple of feet from my tent. No bag or pack or anything with him. Just a guy. He saw me open the tent, his eyes got huge, like he had just seen a ghost, and he took off. It shook me up pretty badly, but over the next day I managed to put it out of my mind fairly well, after writing it off as some odd occurrence, and a guy that was probably high on something, and had somehow managed to set up a camp coincidentally not far from mine. Then, 2 days after that, and 10 to 15 miles away in totally random directions that nobody could take the same path as on accident, I was sitting by the fire that night and started hearing noises that I got more and more convinced were a person. I called out to them, and out of the darkness someone was like, "Do you know how to get to Bell's Canyon?" I said no. I don't even think that's a real place there. They kept talking from just out of my line of vision. I tried to see them with my flashlight, but they yelled, "Aim that away." And kind of spooked and not wanting to piss off a potential crazy person, I did. After like 15 minutes of me being very freaked out, and them talking and asking completely random questions from the darkness, it sounded like the voice had gotten closer, so I shined my light that way again. And it was the same dude who had been outside my tent 2 nights before. He had to have followed me almost 15 miles over 2 days, because there is no way he could have accidentally wound up in the same spot, as vast as that wilderness is. No possible way. As soon as my light hit him, he took off again. I started to chase him, but didn't want to get lost in the wilderness in the dark, so stopped quickly after probably only 100 to 200 feet. This one couldn't be written off because the only way he could have been in both places is specifically if he was following me. I decided the trip was very over first thing in the morning, and hiked back over 3 days, constantly doubling back, trying to throw off anyone following my trail, and occasionally hiding and waiting to see if he would come by following me. I really can't describe how terrifying it was to feel like I was being hunted through the woods, and to actually have to brainstorm on things I could do to best avoid potentially being murdered. On the first night of hiking out, twice I heard what sounded like a person walking in circles outside my tent, but by the time I mustered the courage to look, nobody was there. On the second night, I heard what I thought was an animal making noises at first in the distance, but slowly decided sounded more like a human making animal calls. But could have actually been an animal, but I didn't actually see the guy again. But it really sounded like a person making howling noises. I literally almost cried when I finally got back to the car. The relief was so strong. To this day, probably the most terrifying experience I've had. I have no idea who the guy was or what his intentions were, and no way of getting an explanation. But I really can't articulate just what a terrifying few days it was. When I was in grade school, my family lived in a house that sat directly across from the school I attended. However, there was about half a mile of wooded area between them. I was allowed to walk to and from school because it was so straightforward. My mother informed me that she and her siblings walked through the woods to school when they were younger, so it felt like a natural and safe thing for her. I loved the excitement of being able to walk to school all on my own, and I felt pretty at home in the woods as I had been raised around them. The walk was pretty direct with very little issues, aside from a small but wide creek that I had to cross. The creek itself was no problem. It was the fact that on each side there was a steep bank that had to be scaled. It wasn't too terrible unless it had been raining. It had rained the day before, so my steps that were normally loud were fairly silent. This might have saved my life. It at least saved me from something terrible. When I reached the creek, I was in my own little world. I was thinking about a science project we had to do at school and whether or not I was fully prepared to take part in it. I was doing some supernova section and wasn't feeling very ready to make a speech in front of everyone explaining it. Anyway, I reached the creek and dropped down the first bank with a slightly wet thud. I crossed over the water and began to look for something to grab hold of to pull myself up with. There were usually roots sticking out to use. Before I could climb up the other side, I heard a noise, like people talking. I stopped and waited to see if I could hear it again. I did. I heard a couple of boys talking, getting closer to me. I smashed myself up against the back and listened for a minute. I don't know why, but something told me to stay away, that something was wrong. The boys came so close, all the way to the edge of the creek bank, but they didn't jump down. If they had, they would have seen me in a flash. As luck would have it, there was an overhang that I was able to hide under. I listened as the boys talked. "Yeah, she comes through here all the time. Should be coming around in just a minute." My heart sank. I was the only person that walked this trail to and from school, and they were in my direct path. That isn't to say that no one else was ever in the woods, but in all the time I used the trail, I had never seen another person. To get to the woods from my house, I had to cross the road and walk through a small flat area with no trees. And from the school side, I had to walk through the school's football field. Anyone from either side could have seen me going in or out of the woods easily. I stood plastered to the wall of mud, waiting for them to catch me. But they walked around a little bit, smoked a couple of cigarettes and started getting frustrated. "Where the fuck is she, man? You said she was going to be here, so where is she? Maybe she isn't coming to school today. Anyway, we gotta go, we're gonna miss our bus." The high schoolers caught their bus to the high school at the elementary school. This told me two things. One, they were obviously in high school, so much older than me. And two, they had some seriously bad intentions towards me. I heard them leaving, but I didn't dare move. I waited a good 30 minutes or so before I darted out of the creek bed towards home. I will never know exactly what those two boys had planned to do to me that day, and I'm not sure I want to. So, creepy high schoolers waiting in the woods for a little girl, let's not meet. My family has a camping timeshare, and we used to go camping for weeks at a time in the summer. My dad had to work, so he would stay at home and come meet us at the campgrounds Friday to Sunday. The campgrounds had a pool, miniature golf course, basketball courts, and we'd gone for so long that my mum was comfortable letting us wander since there was only one entrance and exit. When I was around 8, but small for my age, so I looked about 5, I met a little boy who was camping with his single dad for a few days. He came to our campsite a lot and knew we were staying for a while. I was pretty sad when he left, but his dad said they'd come back sometime soon. A few weeks later, his dad came to the campsite right after my mum left to take a shower. He told me his son was coming later that week. He asked where my parents were, and I told him my dad doesn't come until Friday, and my mum always takes a shower at this time. He said bye and left. The next day, he came by at the same time and told me that he had just found some kittens and asked if I wanted one. I said yes. He told me he kept them in his tent, and I could come pick one. Now, this guy wasn't a stranger. My mum had met him when he picked up his son from our campsite. So I didn't get that creepy stranger vibe and get going with him. We walked towards his campsite, but then he told me he actually moved them to his truck so they wouldn't get hot, which made sense to me. He pointed to his truck right outside the gates of the entrance. I started walking towards the entrance with the guy when my dad pulls up. He got the day off work so he could spend more time with us. He asks, "What's going on?" And I say, "Tommy's dad said he had kittens in his truck and I could have one." My dad gets out the car and tells me to run back to the campsite, so I do. When my dad gets back, he tells me never to go alone with an adult anywhere, even if I know them. I asked my mum years later about the whole thing, and she told me my dad kicked the crap out of him and called the cops. I wasn't sure about sharing this story. It still gives me shivers every time I remember what happened. This happened in the Amazonas, in the border between Brazil and Peru. The jungle is an amazing place to live. Everyone knew each other, and I had a big group of friends of different ages. The only horrible part of the Amazon is the existence of terrorist groups that try to control the region. I was 7 when this happened. Every kid in the village knew we had freedom to go anywhere, as long as it's not close to the terrorists, and we could never leave the village at night. My parents taught me since I was very little how to hide in case something happens, and to run if I see things will get dangerous. I remember all the adults of the village were celebrating something. I think it was an Amazonian party like Halloween. I remember my mother painting her face in a tribal way, and all the children went together to a house to stay safe and have fun. The eldest girl was in charge. She was 17, and as soon as our parents left, she ignored us and left with her friends. Our closest group consisted of 6 children. I was one of the youngest ones, and we all listened to the most adventurous one, Leon, who was 14. Whatever Leon said, we followed, because he was fun, always making challenges, and he knew how to take care of us. Yes, despite him being reckless, he was our friend. We loved him, and we knew that he would never abandon us if something happened. After playing soccer and eating, the 6 of us became bored. Carla, one of the 6, had the idea to dress up like our parents did, with tribal makeup and dresses. We agreed, and soon we were all dressed up like the kids who lived in the village of the deepest regions of the Amazon. I remember us playing around until Leon said to, and I quote, "Let's explore the Amazon and find a hidden treasure." We all cheered and agreed to leave. It was easy to escape, since the girl who was supposed to take care of us just left us. Leon managed to find a lantern and a boat big enough for us 6, and we decided to sail. It was around midnight, but we didn't care. Just imagine 6 kids dressed up, on a boat, splashing water everywhere, and trying to find an imaginary treasure. No phones, no adults, just the jungle and us. It was life at its purest. Everything seemed to be perfect until we hear people calling, "Who's there?" And we saw a lit boat approaching. Quickly, Leon dropped the lantern and instructed us to lay down on the boat's floor and stay very still. It was one of the scariest moments of my life. I remember it clearly how we were all with our bellies to the floor, grabbing our hands and not even daring to breathe, but it was too late. "Stop hiding, I see you," a voice said as the guy illuminated our boat. We stood up, and I saw 4 men with guns pointing at us, and I'm not talking about small pistols. They laughed and said, "They're a bunch of children." Leon put himself in front and said that we were in a hurry because our parents were expecting us home. The biggest guy, who had a red bandana, laughed and said, "Little kids should not be here alone at night. You could disappear here in the jungle and no one would ever find you." At this point I was super scared, and Carla started crying. "You can go." And they left. I remember all of us hugging each other, crying and sailing as fast as we could. Once we got home, we entered the house and closed all the doors and windows. We all slept together on the floor, but before that we agreed not to tell this to anyone in the village. Not the elders or our parents. Even now, no one knows what happened that night. Years later, I understood why they let us go. They thought we were kids from the local tribe. We had no value to them. If they had known that we were dressed up and the village we came from, I probably wouldn't be typing this story. This happened back in 2004 in northern Wisconsin. I was 16 at the time and out deer hunting with my dad and a friend of his, Frank. I do remember this day like it was yesterday though. The dialogue isn't word for word, but the idea is 100% accurate. My dad and I had a few different stands over an area maybe 3 to 4 square miles. He had been hunting there for at least 10 years, and I'd been going with him since I was 5. Up until I was 12, the legal age to hunt with a rifle, I'd just been tagging along. This particular morning, we walked to my first stand. It was about 5 AM, so still dark outside. I got situated and my dad and Frank went off to the other 2 stands over a ridge, maybe another 500 to 600 yards off. Sitting there in the dark is always a little eerie. Not long after my dad and Frank left, I see a flashlight from the general direction of where they headed, maybe 200 yards away, roughly moving my direction. I figured they forgot something from the truck or something, so I radioed to see what they were doing. "We're sitting in my stand. Frank is about to head to the other one," he says. Obviously this flashlight is someone else. This isn't super uncommon and isn't really a big deal. Those woods get crowded sometimes and there is a spot to park in that general direction. I turn on my light so the other hunter can see that there is someone there. He stops. I see the light turn and go a different direction. No big deal. I end up dozing off while it's still dark out. When I wake up, the sun's up. It's around 8 AM. I sit there for a bit. Radio my dad to see if he's heard or seen anything moving. Nothing yet. A couple of gunshots off in the distance is all. I get up and go for a slow walk to get my blood moving. Not far, maybe 30 yards out and back. Trying not to make a sound, I come back to my stand, sit down, and take a real good look around. Nothing really going on. I finally look out to my left, where I'd seen the flashlight before, and see orange. For anyone unfamiliar, hunters have to wear blaze orange during gun season. I radio my dad and Frank to see if either of them were moving around, but Dad said no. I hear nothing from Frank. I grab the binoculars out of my backpack and see if it's Frank. It's definitely not. This guy is looking at me through his scope. Rifle aimed directly fucking at me. This is a huge no-no. Massive rules we all learn in hunter's education. Never point your rifle at something you don't intend to shoot. Dumb people still do it though. It's few and far between, but it happens. This is why normal people use binoculars. My first thought, what a fucking dickbag. Thing is, even with me looking at him, he doesn't put his gun down. Now I'm starting to panic, thinking I'm going to be the next hunting murder victim. I slowly grab my rifle, get up, staying behind as many trees as I can, and walk down a little path to the side of my stand. My stand was on this kind of knoll on the other side of a much larger hill. I radio my dad telling him what's up. He tells me to sit tight and stay out of sight. Obviously, as a 16-year-old, I couldn't do that. I had to keep looking. Every time I looked, the guy was still aiming in my direction, but was always standing in a different spot. Like, I would look, go back to hiding, look again, and he would be 30 yards from where he was the last time. About 10 minutes of this goes by when my dad radios me. "How you doing, bud?" Looking back, he was very obviously trying to keep me calm. At the time, I thought he just wasn't taking me seriously. He's still there, but he keeps moving. I don't know what his problem is. Dad told me to just keep hidden and he'll figure it out, and that he'll be coming up near him in a minute or two. That's when I hear the shot. I lost my shit trying to get hold of my dad. Did he just get shot? Where the fuck is he? Did he have to shoot the guy? What the fuck is going on? I sit there for maybe 2 to 3 minutes that felt like hours. Alright, come on out and head towards my stand. I peek up over the little knoll I was behind and see my dad waving along the ridge the random guy had been on. I make the trek on over to him to see what happened. Turns out Frank was feeling a little restless and took a little stroll and ended up on the other side of that particular ridge the stranger was on, not knowing he was there. He had knocked his radio battery loose while he was getting situated earlier in the morning and had no idea anything was even going on. The shot I heard was actually Frank shooting a deer. Dad said as soon as Frank shot, the guy walked off away from us towards the logging road. We helped Frank out with his deer and decided to call it an early day. Although I was extremely nervous, the rest of the weekend went with no incidents. So, dumbass stranger in the woods with no common sense, let's never meet. I live in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains in northeast Georgia. It's a beautiful area with hundreds of miles of national forest, some great state parks and tons of fantastic camping places. Unfortunately, my hometown is also relatively poor. While there are some out-of-town residents from Atlanta and other places, a lot of people where I live are really poor. I do freelance work as a technical writer, so I can do most of my work online. If I didn't have that going for me, I'd have to move somewhere else. It's just one of those small towns that will rob you of your ability to accomplish anything in life if you stay there too long, without anything else going for you at least. Excluding a handful of doctors and lawyers and Georgia Power Company employees, the only employment in the area is at Walmart, fast food, and a couple of grocery stores. To the east of my town there's a massive national forest. It's loaded with great camping sites and lots of relatively unused hiking trails. I really enjoy hiking on them with my dog, but it can be a bit of an unnerving experience sometimes. It's about a 10-mile drive from town, and there's no cell phone service or homes for miles. In the past, there have been a lot of vehicle break-ins at the trailheads. The gravel parking lots at some of them are glittered with bits of broken glass from what I'm guessing were car windows. Sometimes there are really shifty people hanging around these trailheads or just driving around on the Forest Service roads. These are really rough roads, and you'll see these beat-up $500 cars just barreling along the roads meant for a 4x4. Some of the people you see in the cars look like the guy that got crushed by the ATM in Breaking Bad. All that being said, it's still a great place to camp. However, you do have to be careful. A few years ago, 2 of my friends and I decided to play paintball in the national forest. Probably not legal, I know. We decided to turn the paintball expedition into a camping trip so we could play the next morning too. After a pretty uneventful day of shooting paintballs at each other, we drive a couple of miles to one of the more popular camping spots. Unfortunately, a church group or something had taken up all the spots in the area. This was really the only camping spot that we were familiar with, and it was getting pretty late. We decided to keep on looking, so we drove for about an hour further and further into the woods. By this time, it's getting a bit dark, and we're getting a bit worried about finding a spot. We all had GPS on our smartphones, but none of us had any service. We turn off onto an unfamiliar road that isn't in very good shape. In fact, it looks like the Forest Service rangers used a backhoe to block off the road with a mound of dirt. A broken metal barrier lay in the woods nearby. That said, it looked like 4x4 vehicles had been going over the mound, so it was pretty worn down. Our F-150 had pretty high clearance, so we decided to go over the mound. There was an old gravel road on the other side, and the road was pretty much clear of debris. We drove a few miles down this road and came across an opening next to a small creek. There were some blue tarps hanging over a plywood table nailed to a tree. This seemed kind of odd. That said, it was pretty much dark at this point, and we didn't want to keep driving around all night looking for a camping spot. We left the truck light running and we set up the tent. As we were setting up the tent, I started to notice there was a lot of trash in the woods surrounding the site. I see a green bottle laying on the ground. I take a look at the label and see that it's a bottle of home and garden insecticide. I was really tired at this time, and I just thought that someone had been dumping their home garbage out here. None of us thought that it was weird that someone would be dumping garbage in an area that was more than an hour from the nearest home. We set up camp, had some beers, made some chili from scratch. By this time, it was probably around 11 PM. As we were eating, we noticed a faint glow from the other side of the nearby hill. At first, we thought it was moonlight filtering its way through the trees. However, the angles didn't make sense. It didn't seem to be a bright light, and it wasn't moving. It was kind of like that glow you see over a bright city. We couldn't see the light source itself though. Since there were no other access roads in the area, we decided it wasn't other campers. The hill was about a quarter of a mile from our campsite, so we decided to go investigate. Under normal circumstances, I know I wouldn't have done so. However, we had all had a few rum and cokes in our stomachs, and two of us, Jacob and I, decided to take a look. My other friend, Isaac, decided to stay behind and pop some popcorn over the fire. We start walking towards the light source, and the situation gets even stranger. All the trees in the area have their bark knocked off in a circle around their trunks. We thought it could have been the work of a beaver that lived in the creek, but it seems strange that a beaver would go around all these trees and just knock off the bark in a circle. Jacob and I started talking about the ghost beaver in pretty loud voices, probably due to our drunkenness. As we were almost at the top of the hill, Jacob tripped and yelled, "Oh shit!" A few seconds after he yelled, the light, whatever it was, went out. We looked at each other and decided that maybe we don't need to see what the light was after all. We walked back in silence and keep looking back every few seconds. We decide to turn off our flashlight and just use the moonlight to get back to the campsite. When we get a couple of 100 feet from the campsite, I can see my other friend Isaac walking around. He was wearing a hooded coat that I hadn't seen him wearing before. For some reason, he's carrying his paintball gun around in his hand. That seemed a little odd, we each said to each other. The fire had started to go down, so we couldn't see our campsite very well. At this point, we'd probably been gone for almost an hour. From the distance, it looked like Isaac was looking for something. He kept walking around the site and was peering into the tent. When we were almost back to the campsite, we saw Isaac walk up the road that we came in on. We figured that he was going to go to the bathroom and didn't want to wander through the woods like us. When we got back, we sat next to the fire and waited for Isaac to come back. All of a sudden, we see him lurch out of the tent. He stumbles a few feet and vomits. After we left, he had a couple more rum and cokes, he mumbles. We ask him why he kept wandering around the campsite with his paintball gun, and he then gets a strange look on his face. They're locked up in the cab of the truck. Did you unlock it? We go back to the truck, enter the door code, and see all our paintball equipment just as we left it before. The keys to the truck were still hidden in a magnetic fob underneath. I get a sinking feeling in the pit of my stomach. "Isaac, what were you doing after we left?" I ask. I was watching a movie on my phone, then I fell asleep, I guess." "But you were walking around with your paintball gun, right? Did you just change jackets?" Isaac said he'd been in the tent since we left, and that he'd been wearing the same unhooded fleece all night. Someone had been walking around our campsite, and it wasn't Isaac. At this point, all of us are way too drunk to drive, but we decide to go ahead and pack up and go back to my house for the night. We don't bother packing up the tent, we just fold it down with our sleeping bags and everything in it. We jump in the F-150 and start to drive out. When we get to the dirt hump, we see something grey blocking our path. The metal barrier that had been lying in the woods earlier is now back on its stand, right on top of the hump earlier. By this point, all of us had sobered up to the situation. No one wants to get out of the car to try and move the barrier. But I had a metal guard on the front of the F-150, so I drive forward slowly, tapping on the metal barrier with the front of my truck. It falls right off. It must have been just balanced on the top. And we drive slowly over it. We were terrified that it would pop one of the truck's tyres as we drove over it, but it didn't. As we drive down the road, we see a vehicle following us with its lights off. It's probably about 1,000 feet behind us, but we keep catching glimpses of it as the moon reflects light off it. I start to drive as fast as I can on the Forest Service road, and the other vehicle keeps pace. It doesn't get any closer though, it stays just 1 or 2 turns behind us. We can only see it when the road straightens out. After about 45 minutes of speeding along gravel roads, we make it back to the main paved road. I start to drive everyone back to my house, but I decide to go a different way just to be safe. I didn't get pulled over for DUI, luckily. Camping can be fun, but very rural camping can be dangerous. I've driven past that metal barrier since that time, but it's always been in place. I would never go down that road again though.